So Matt and I are going on a hike to show you what I think is one of the prettiest things ever in Appalachia, one of the prettiest things there is about the Appalachian landscape. So we're just barely left the house, we're just barely up in the woods so far, and right here is one of the clues about what we're going to find. Matt and I have been out on a hike today, and I wanted to show you the ivy blooms. See how beautiful they are? The ivy's blooming all around my house, on the banks and off the bank. It's a natural plant that grows naturally in the southern highlands of Appalachia. And you may be thinking, but Tipper, that's not ivy. Ivy is like the green vine that grows and sometimes takes over trees, buildings, and anything that stands still. But all my life, this is what we've called ivy. Sometimes you'll hear this plant, it's kind of like a bushy tree. It's not like a full tree, more like a bush, but in some cases the trunks of it do get extremely large. But this is what we call, sometimes mountain ivy, but mostly just ivy is what I've heard as I was growing up in Appalachia. What the actual name of this plant is, it's actually mountain laurel. There's another plant very similar, rhododendron, that's what we call mountain laurel. It's got longer leaves, has a different bloom, and the bloom, it's not time for it to bloom. You just now begin to see buds on it. The ivy blooms first, and as you can see, the little leaves are kind of like rhododendron leaves, but they're small. They're just about that big, whereas rhododendron leaves are much larger. But the unusual way that we call the names that we call them has been documented often over the years. I'm going to read to you a little bit out of the Dictionary of Smoky Mountain English what it has to say about those names. So the entry for ivy is also ivy bush and ivy tree. The mountain laurel tree, same as calico bush and mountain ivy. I've never heard anyone call it a calico bush, but if you look at the blooms, it sure does remind you of calico. I'll be interested to see if maybe you've heard it called calico bush. So 1928, Galen plant naturalist, mountain laurel, known to the mountaineer as ivy, reaches its maximum development in the Smokies. It's not unusual to find laurels 1 foot or more in diameter and many feet high. 1982, wildflowers. Usually the attractive pink or white saucered flowers are so abundant that the mountain laurel in full bloom is one of our most spectacular plants. I agree with that part. It flowers in May and June, the later blossoms ordinarily occurring on plants growing in the higher altitudes. Ivy and calico bush are among its other names. And then in 1997, Montgomery collection, he documented it that it was the ivy by Cardwell and ivy tree by Brown. So sometimes most of the ivies that grow around my house are this kind of this pink, pale pink, white color, but sometimes you'll see them a darker pink. On the way in, Matt and I saw, but it was way up high, but we saw a really deep pink one. Just one though, between where we're at now and back down the holler at our house. We only seen that one that was that dark pink, but it's pretty too. So here's what the dictionary has to say about laurel, what we call laurel. So it's a rhododendron, actually. A variant form is laurel. Laurel. I don't think I've heard anybody call it that. So the 1939 Hall Notebook, White Oak, North Carolina, that's where it was documented as laurel by Fay Leatherwood. So also laurel bush, the mountain term for evergreen rhododendron which grows profusely at elevations below 5,000 feet and covers extensive tracts and thicket, also used in compounds as flat laurel, laurel bed, laurel patch, laurel slick, laurel thicket, and mountain laurel, and in place names. You'll hear a lot of like roads and hollers and different things with that name on it, laurel, and a lot of subdivisions and things like that today. So 1890, Carpenter, Thunderhead, there for the first time we saw the tangle of rhododendron which is called laurel. and forms a dense thicket along on the mountain streams. 1937 Hall collection, Cosby Creek, Tennessee. We have white laurels and red laurels here in the mountains. That was James Benson said that. 1939 Hall collection, Deep Creek, North Carolina. They fought right down to the foot of the ridge into the flat laurel and commenced barking. I thought the bear was treed. That was Mark Cathy. Somebody was quoting him. 1974 Underwood, Madison County. Roderick Shelton and his descendants peopled the area now known as Shelton Laurel. So if calling them by the wrong names that most people do is not confusing enough, it's also confusing because they grow really close together. Right here's an ivy, but if you go right down here, you'll see a mountain laurel. So they're really close, and sometimes they grow on top of each other. At the top of, or at the bottom, where you start down our driveway, at the top, if you're coming up of our driveway, there's an ivy and there's a laurel, and their blooms are just side by side. There they are. The laurel's just about to bloom, and the ivy will be finishing blooming by the time the laurel starts. On the other side of that, down the hill towards Granny's, that was my best playhouse I had when I was a little girl. When Pap and Granny moved into that house, I was about 5 years old, I guess, maybe 6. And out in the backyard, there was a giant old laurel with ivy growing all around the edges, and down inside it made the best place for a little girl to play. I just loved it. That was one of my best playhouses. The floor, or the soil under there, was all moist and had moss and all that from being shaded by the laurel and the ivy. And then if you're familiar with the plant, maybe we could show you, I don't know if this one's just a small one, but we'll show you a larger one as we go out. But their trunks are really like, they get turned this way and that way, and some of them can be really big. So those made perfect little places for a little girl to perch on, and that was just one of my favorite places to play when I was a child. But that's confusing because then you'll have mountain laurel and ivy growing right together, or if you want to call it by the other names, mountain laurel and rhododendron growing right beside each other. So here's an example of laurel and ivy growing really close together. This is laurel. You can see how long the leaf is, and you can see the bud there beginning to bloom. It's going to be a bloom in another few weeks. Right across from it is ivy growing. This is just a little plant. I don't see any blooms on it this year. This one above it that it's growing under has blooms on it up high, but you can see the difference in the leaves. So here's the laurel leaf, and here's the ivy leaf. You can see how much longer the laurel is than the ivy. One time on the Blind Pig and the Acorn, when I wrote about us calling this bushy tree ivy, even though it's mountain laurel, and we call the rhododendron laurel, Bob Dawsomer, a friend of mine, he shared this quote that he had read one time by, I would say, Cecil Sharp. I know a lot of people say Cecil Sharp. Anyway, the ballad collector. So he shared this quote about ivy from him. And it is quite in accordance with the habit of the mountaineer to call things by their wrong names. Laurel for rhododendron, ivy for laurel, vine for ivy, and biscuit for scone. Well, so that's okay. I don't mind that if we call it by the wrong name. But after that, another person shared with me that actually ivy, us calling the plant ivy, is a holdover from way back. So this is what they had to say about it. So in other words, it's not that we're calling it wrong. It's just that over time, what people thought of it, maybe the people who named plants or whoever, they decided to call it by something else. And then that left the mountaineer or the Appalachians calling it by the name it originally was, but then it was no longer called that. So this was what he said. The usage of ivy was once so common that it was a dictionary definition. It is so listed twice in Webster's New International Dictionary in 1913 under ivy and ivy tree, in both cases with the notation Southern U.S. In Patrick County, Virginia, where mountain laurel is still called ivy, like we're doing it, Big Ivy Creek and Little Ivy Creek are named for the great stands that exist in this watershed. So that, in 1913, even the dictionary was calling it ivy. So you can see, and I would say that was during the time, though, that Cecil Sharp would have been traveling about the mountains collecting stuff. I know it was in the early 1900s. I'm sure one of you know when exactly. I know that he traveled some with Olive Dame Campbell, and she come to Brasstown in the early 20s. So it wouldn't have been long after that. But that little part makes me think that no, we called it ivy because it was just called ivy. That's what it was. And then over time, society or people that name plant books or whatever, they're the ones that shifted the names of it, where it left people like my family continuing to call this beautiful plant one of the prettiest things of spring. It is just spectacular. I love being able to look out every window of my house and see the white, puffy looking blooms on the mountainside. It's just a beautiful sight. Here's a beautiful old ivy. You can see how thick the trunks are as they go up and twist and turn. And it's about 20 feet tall, and there are blooms in the very tip top of it. So since ivy and Mount Laurel, or Laurel, ivy and laurel, since they do grow so abundantly in the southern highlands of Appalachia, sometimes you'll hear them, if it's a large, dense part of where they're growing, like maybe a 100-yard area where Mount Laurels and ivy are kind of mixed in together, you'll hear that called a Laurel Hail. Sometimes a laurel thicket, but mostly a Laurel Hail. And that just means that it's hard to get through. You're not just going to start out walking and go straight through it, because their branches turn and twist, their trunks do, and it kind of makes this, it's hard to get through. But the dictionary has a definition for it, and I was going to read you that. Laurel Hail, a dense growth of laurel. 1977, Hamilton, Mountain Memories. Far back in the big mountains were the Laurel Hails, where our tall laurel grew so thick with twisted branches that a man venturing in there might never find his way out. 1980, Campbell, Memories of Smoky. They soon learn, often with sore muscles as a lingering reminder, that the so-called laurel slicks of the Smokies are far from being slick, and that Laurel Hails makes a much more accurate or descriptive name. So they can be so thick. I've read or heard the tall tale before that the surveyors who were surveying the line between Tennessee and North Carolina, that they laid planks on top of them and walked across them. That's probably a tall tale. But I've also heard lots of tales about men and dogs getting lost in Laurel Hails as they were coon hunting and doing other types of hunting. That's like part of the dictionary where it was saying once you enter it, you may never come out, lost and never be seen again. Another good view of laurel and ivy growing so close together they're touching in the middle of the trail. The ivies also have a beautiful, lovely scent, just a soft floral, but really nice smell to them. So one of my favorite books about Appalachia is The Tall Woman, written by Wilma Dykeman. If you've never read it, you can check that out and find it and read it. It's an old book, but there's a quote in that book that I just love. There's lots of quotes in it. When I read a book and I like a quote, I turn down the corner or make a mark, or sometimes I take the time to actually write it out, which is not often. But I keep the book, so it's my book. So turning down the page, I can go back to it and find it again. But she said, "I've always thought the ivy was the prettiest thing growing up here. The way it clings to the mountains, the way it comes in the cut-over places and covers up the scars with blooms in springs. I feel the same way about it. Ivy, the blooming ivy, is one of the prettiest things that I know of when I think about Appalachia. It's just one of the beauties, and it's amazing every year. You think what's beautiful, and then the summer goes on and you forget about it, and then the next spring of the year comes and you're like, oh my goodness, look at the ivy. It's like a new thing every year to see it blooming and dotting the mountainsides with their beautiful, beautiful blooms.